Hi everyone, this week is a rather quick week. We just have two short videos that are going to cover scope ambiguity and their syntax and how their syntactic structure is different for each of the interpretations. And then you'll have an extra, all that extra time you would watching videos or studying to prepare for the test next week and also to finish the assignment that is due this Friday. Okay, so if you recall, the sentence "everyone loves someone" is scope ambiguous. There are two readings. There is the case where first we focus on all of these different individuals and we say for each one of those people they love some person or other. This is the case where we say that the universal has wide scope over the existential. So wide scope meaning that it binds more than the existential. Then we have this other reading where we have a bunch of people, but first we focus on some particular person and we say that all those people like that particular person. And this is the reading where the existential has wide scope over the universal. We say that because the existential is binding more things than the universal, or rather we can say the universal is contained within the scope of the quantifier of the existential. So we could say that the universal here has narrow scope. Or we could say the existential has wide scope, and in the first interpretation we could say the existential has narrow scope. It depends which one you want to pick as your baseline reading. Now, before we jump into the syntax of this, I just want to make a statement about entailment first. So the existential wide scope reading entails the existential narrow scope reading. In other words, what this means is that every single condition, like every single time that this reading is true, every single time that B is true, A will also be true. So the truth of the second interpretation forces the truth of the first interpretation. Because in the second interpretation, every single person out there does like someone. It just happens to be the same person. So there's really just, if we think about this reading, the existential with wide scope, there's one particular way to make this true. But in terms of the wide scope reading of the universal, A, where we focus on the people first and they can like some person or other, there's many different ways we can configure this to be true. So for example, in this case, if there are three people out there, it's still perfectly fine for all people in our universe to like one particular person. This is okay. It's still true. So you could almost think of it as being the exists a y for all x has one particular way of making it work, while for all x there exists a y. There's like many different possible ways for this to work. So if the wide scope reading of the existential is true, then the narrow scope reading of the existential is true. So this isn't a hugely important point, but it does show that there is some relation of entailment between these two interpretations. So I guess this isn't really how language necessarily works, but if you were to interpret a sentence that is ambiguous, if you interpret it with the second interpretation here, at least you'll always get a correct interpretation. It will be true when it should be true. So a minor thing, not really practical, but well, not really practical for reality because the different meanings, they do have different meanings to them, but there is an entailment relationship between them. Anyway, this is really about scope ambiguity and how we represent it syntactically. So if you remember from earlier, we did lexical ambiguity, structural ambiguity, we did referential ambiguity in the first assignment as an exploration problem, and then we do scope ambiguity. We saw with lexical ambiguity and with referential ambiguity, you just have different words. You have different words or different meanings associated with the words, and with referential ambiguity, referencing different pronouns. So when you talk about ambiguity there, we might have a similar structure, but the meanings, the nodes, are lexical terminals, they're different. So that gives us a different interpretation as we go up our tree. With structural ambiguity, the structure of the sentence is different. So as we interpret things up our tree, the structures will give us different interpretations and we'll end up with two different results. And we've seen that with the not A and B case compare with not A and B. So we've seen this with our trees. So Q4, sorry, not Q4, A4 question 1, we saw that shown with two different trees with structural ambiguity. So if we have ambiguity From the three that we've seen so far, lexical, structural, and referential, there's either a difference in the word or a difference in the structure, or a difference in the meaning of the word. But with these sentences with scope ambiguity, it's a bit of a problem because the words are exactly the same. Everyone doesn't have multiple meanings. Someone doesn't have multiple meanings. Loves doesn't have multiple meanings if we keep the meaning of loves the same. So that's not leading to scope ambiguity. We also don't necessarily see a structural difference because this should just be an SN, VP, VTN sentence. It should be something like this. So it seems as if one structure is giving us two different meanings, but this doesn't make sense because when we do our syntactic trees, we do our semantic trees. As we build up the tree, we're going to get one interpretation. So they need to have different structures. They need to have something different lexically in order to give us two different interpretations. We have to have that. So we need to think about our model of the grammar first. And this is what we assume for X-bar theory minimalism, but we don't really put this at the forefront until you see 322 if the theoretical lecture is done and you talk about it. So we start, of course, with this thing called deep structure or lexical resources. So this is before all movement happens. This is what 322 focuses mostly on. You start with a deep structure, and then you do some movement. So syntactic derivation, you can call this movement. And what you get is you get surface structure. So this is really what 322 is about. At this point, you have a sentence with a word order, a sentence that you can say. So it's to be spoken out loud. It goes to this thing called phonological form. So this is when it is said, and that is my picture of a person saying something out loud. So this is phonological form, it's being spoken. For interpretation and for meaning purposes, then it goes to this other thing called logical form, which we call LF. And more movement happens here in logical form. But it is called covert movement. So you can't see it. It doesn't show up in the word order. So we can move around our words as much as we want in logical form. Now, we still have to motivate it for reasons. We can't just do it randomly. It has to be motivated to give us a correct interpretation, to resolve ambiguity or something like that. But we can do extra movement there. And we actually do our semantics on logical form. So it's looked like this entire course, like we've done our semantics on the surface structure of the sentence, but the reality is that we just haven't moved anything. So we've been doing semantics on a simplified logical form. And when we resolve scope ambiguity, we'll also be doing semantics on logical form. So let's see how movement works in LF. Okay, so what happens is we start with our sentence, everyone loves someone. So we have this basic structure for a sentence. We have an N, we have a transitive verb, we have an N. So what happens is there are two different interpretations. There's an interpretation with for all x there exists a y, and there's an interpretation for exists a y for all x. So what we do is we do this process called quantifier raising, where we take the quantified noun phrases, we introduce a sentence node above the current sentence, and we move that quantified noun phrase up into that NP position for that sentence. So if we want to do the for all x exists a y reading, what we can do is we can take this word someone, we can create a new S node, and we can move that NP into that position, into that S node. And what we have to do is we have to give it a subscript. So I call this J, and I subscript it on the noun phrase. So that way I have a trace of where that word came from, and I know which NP is indexed with it. I know that these two positions are related. So someone came from this position beside loves, and it's moved into this higher position. Then we can take our subject here, everyone, and we can do the same thing because it's a quantified noun phrase. We can take it, we can introduce a new sentence level, and we can move it up and leave a trace. So in this case, we've done I, and we've indexed the NP with I right there. So that's how we can get for all x there exists a y. Now, when we do exists a y all x, we do the same process. But instead of choosing someone to move up first and everyone after, so everyone scopes over someone, We just do it in the reverse. So, for example, first we take everyone from the subject, we create a new node, and we move it up and we index it. So this is everyone corresponding with the index I. So that's the subject moving up first. And then we can do it with the object. So we create a new S node, we give this an index, and we move it up. So now someone is scoping over everyone, and we get the exists a Y for all X interpretation. Now, when we do compositional semantics, we'll get two different interpretations because although the structure is the same between two sentences, the word order is different. So everyone will scope over someone in this left interpretation. In the right interpretation, someone will scope over everyone in the end, and we'll get our two different interpretations. So this is an introduction to how scope ambiguity works. We're going to do one part of the next lecture this week as well, where we take a look at actually how to do the syntax and look at the new rules of our new fragment. So the new syntactic rules of our new fragment of English, so we can deal with things like every farmer, some doctor, and so on. So if there's any questions, always discussion board, email, and I'll answer you there.